Remain, if you would turn with me in your Bibles to the book of Exodus, chapter 3, verses 1 through 14. And as usual, if you would, I would recommend that you keep your fingers in that section. I'm not going to be reading too much from any other places today. I'm going to be taking almost every reference textually from Exodus 3 anyway, but I'm not going to be changing the slides, so I'm not going to be able to put the images up on the board. I just kind of ran out of time in terms of prep here. I'm a little bit disheveled. Let me get my stuff up here. But I want to start this morning by reading from the text, and then we'll go ahead and unpack it together. And in verse 1, it says, "Now Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the far side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. And there the angel of the Lord appeared to him in flames of fire from within a bush. And Moses saw that though the bush was on fire, it did not burn up. So Moses thought, I will go over and see this strange sight, why the bush does not burn up. When the Lord saw that he had gone over to look, God called to him from within the bush, Moses, Moses. And Moses said, Here I am. Do not come any closer. God said, Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground. Then he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. At this Moses hid his face, because he was afraid to look at God. The Lord said, I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard them crying out because of their slave drivers, and I am concerned about their suffering. So I have come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians and bring them up out of that land into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey. And now the cry of the Israelites has reached me, and I have seen the way the Egyptians are oppressing them. So now, go, I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. But Moses said to God, Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? And God said, I will be with you. And this will be the sign to you that it is I who have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you will worship God on this mountain. Moses said to God, Suppose that I go to the Israelites and say to them, The God of your fathers has sent me to you. And they ask me, What is his name? Then what shall I tell them? God said to Moses, I am who I am. This is what you are to say to the Israelites. I am has sent me to you. And we'll stop there. Now, chances are that some version of this story is familiar to you, even if you've never opened a Bible in your life. Most of us have here in this room, but even if you haven't, it's probably familiar to you. This is one of the more famous accounts. The burning bush, the voice out of the fire, the taking off of your sandals. It's one of those handfuls of biblical scenes that's worked its way into the culture at large. It's referenced in movies, in books, and in casual conversation, even by people who couldn't even tell you what book of the Bible it's in. But there's a name in this passage that Jewish tradition has treated so sacred and so weighty that for centuries it was barely spoken out loud. When ancient Jewish scribes copied the scriptures, they'd come to his name, the name that God gives Moses in verse 14 here, and something in them would hesitate. Some traditions say scribes would actually stop and wash themselves and even change their pen before writing it. They took it very seriously. When scripture was read aloud in the synagogue, the reader wouldn't pronounce the name at all. They'd substitute something else. They'd say Adonai or Lord rather than actually letting the true name cross their lips. And over enough centuries, something inevitably happened by them doing this. They lost the pronunciation entirely. The original Hebrew was written with consonants only, no vowels, and the vowel sounds were so rarely spoken out loud that they simply disappeared from memory. So scholars today make educated guesses And some of you might have heard what those are. Some of you have heard Yahweh or Jehovah or something of that nature. They're guesses at this point as to what the name of God actually sounds like, but in truth, no one can speak with certainty on what the actual name sounds like as it was heard the first time. But here is the good news. The good news is that even though we've lost the sound of the name, we haven't lost the meaning of the name, because in this passage, God doesn't just give Moses 4 Hebrew letters. He gives Moses an explanation. And from this account, we're going to look at 3 characteristics of himself that God reveals in the name that he gives to Moses, I am. And we're going to unpack those now as our points. The first is eternal. That is to say, when God was saying to Moses, I am is my name, he was saying, I am eternal. I am eternal. And he states this plainly in verses 1 through 6 as he was identifying himself through Moses' ancestors. And I'm just giving you this portion where it says, then he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. In other words, the same God who was with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in their generations is present with Moses now. That's what he's basically saying there. How is that possible? How can God be equally completely present in the moment that Moses was in, and at the same time be present in the past with his forefathers? The answer, quite simply, is that God is eternal. He doesn't move through time the same way that we do, arriving somewhere and leaving it behind and growing more distant from the past with every passing year. He simply is in every generation all at once. He is eternal. Now, how does this work? If you guys can explain it to me, you guys can have this job, all right? I can't explain it exactly, but I can tell you this. God illustrates it to some degree through the way he reveals himself. In particular, he revealed himself through a burning bush. We see it here in the text. There, the angel of the Lord appeared to him in flames of fire from within a bush. Moses saw that though the bush was on fire, it did not burn up. You know, if you think about a normal fire, there is a moment of ignition. There is a period where it burns, consuming its fuel, and then there's an end. The fuel runs out, the fire dies. So there's a beginning, and there's a middle, and there's an end. And every fire you've watched, and by the way, we're watching a lot of fires over the course of the summer. It follows that pattern. There is the beginning where it ignites, and kind of you're getting it to life, and then there's its middle phase where it's roaring and consuming its fuel, and then it kind of burns out as it runs out of fuel. That's the way fire works in this world. But the fire in this text didn't work that way. There was no ignition. Moses saw no ignition point. There was no consumption. The bush stayed intact, even though it was roaring with fire. That's in fact something that Moses noted. He saw the bush burn and burn and burn, and it never went away. He finally says, I'm going to go see this. This is something unusual. And this text gives us no apparent end. This fire operated outside the rules that govern every other fire in existence, which was exactly the point here. God was showing Moses, before he ever explained it in words, that he exists outside the rules that the rest of us live under. He's self-existent, he's uncaused, he's without beginning, and he's without end. And as simple as it sounds, he was illustrating it to Moses, not just with the words that he said, but he was with the image of a bush that burned but never consumed itself. It just operated in a totally different self-existent way. What does it mean? It means that God is aware. Nothing is taking God by surprise. This is what it means, at least in part, when we say that God is eternal. And it's important because sometimes as human beings in this fallen present world, we can let ourselves believe that we live in a day that is so appalling and so unprecedented that even God must be shocked by all the terrible things that are happening right now, quote unquote. And by the way, there are bad things happening in this world now, but there have been bad things happening in this world a long time before this time. Some might argue that even in the 500s AD is some of the worst times ever in human history. But we can think that right now, We're in like the worst time ever, especially when we're saturating ourselves with toxic news cycles and stuff like that. And the reason that I share this is because I was at the VA hospital a few days ago, just going in for my regular monthly or yearly checkup, and I was waiting in the waiting room, and there was this guy sitting in the waiting room, speaking, trying to engage everyone around him to warn us about all those lines in the sky that you see. Those actually aren't clouds, those are planes, and they're putting chemtrails in the sky, and they're corrupting the climate. They're, what do you call it, biochemical engineering or something like that. The whole idea was that there was these planes spraying chemicals to try to engineer the climate for some nefarious purpose. And how does someone get to that place? It happens when you let yourself believe that the world has become too broken and too far gone and too shocking for even God himself to have seen it coming. It's when it's gotten so out of control that God doesn't even have control over it anymore. The reality is that nothing happening today surprises God. Would you believe me if I told you that? There's nothing happening today to surprise him, and there's nothing coming tomorrow that's going to surprise him either. You're like, oh, AI, all this stuff's happening. He's eternal. He was present in the past, he is present now, and he's present, he will be present in the future, all in the same way. All right, it's even hard to describe this stuff to you because he doesn't follow the same laws that we do. He's already there. He was present in every generation before ours, and he's present in every one still ahead now in some way. Nothing's going to surprise him. He's aware. But I need you to understand something. It's not enough to stop there, or it's not enough, I should say, to stop at that point. Awareness by itself doesn't necessarily bring comfort. And what I mean here is that a person can be aware of oppression and suffering and need without caring enough to lift a finger to do anything about it. With that in mind, God doesn't stop at saying he's eternal or that he's aware. There's more to it. He also says, I am engaged. And when he's saying I am eternal, but he's also saying I am engaged. And we see that particularly in verses 7 through 10 of the text. And so follow along with me. I'm going to read that whole section because he's really communicating the idea that not only is he eternal, but he is engaged, all right? The Lord said, and I quote, I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard them crying out because of their slave drivers, and I am concerned about their suffering. So I have come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians and to bring them up out of the land into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey. And now the cry of the Israelites has reached me, and I have seen the way the Egyptians are oppressing them. And so he heard the cries of his people, and he's doing something about it. Not only is he aware that there's something happening, he's doing something about it. What does it mean? It means two things. It means, firstly, that God is active. Just because we don't see God responding to the problems of this world doesn't mean that he's not responding. For example, and again, it's hard to understand this from an eternal perspective, but one of the ways we can try to wrap our mind around it is by trying to watch a plant grow. You ever tried to do that? It's possible now with time-lapse photography, but to stand there and to stare at a plant is futile. You can stand there for an hour, you can stare as hard as you want, but you're not going to see a single measurable inch of movement. It's only with things like technology like time-lapse photography, where we have hours of footage compressed into seconds, that we can actually watch the process unfold and realize that the growth was actually happening the entire time. It was just happening too slowly for our eyes to register it in a moment, and perhaps eternity will work something like that for us. A vantage point where we will finally be able to see God's intervention in the fallen world, kind of in the way that we see time-lapse photography today, where the growth was constant, and in the same way his intervention was constant and active, but it was just simply too vast and too slow for us to perceive with our finite eyes in the moment. And with that in mind, it's foolish to assume that God is not responding to our problems, because he is in fact definitely responding to our problems. And think of it this way: from where Israel stood, 400 years of slavery in Egypt, they would have definitely felt abandoned. They would have definitely felt like God did not see and he was doing nothing about it as generation after generation went by. But in fact, we see from this text that he saw it all along and he was doing something about it all along. So God is active. Even if we can't see it, doesn't mean it's not happening. And we will understand it all unfolding someday. But secondly, it also means that God cares. It means that God cares deeply. He's concerned. It says it right in the text. I see them and I am concerned about them. Just as he heard every single cry of Israel in bondage in Egypt, he hears your pain and he hears your struggles as well. And he's responding right now, even if you can't see it and even if you can't feel it. But this means something else as well. It means that he cares equally for all those people with cares and struggles that this world has forgotten about. And by the way, before we excuse ourselves, who are those people that we forget about? Who are those people that are too annoying or too bothersome or too dirty or too whatever, undeserving for us to really pay attention to? God sees them too. God cares about them too. And we align ourselves most closely with God when we advocate for the people that this world overlooks. When we force ourselves to notice the people that God overlooks. And on the flip side, we imitate this fallen world's coldness whenever we overlook people ourselves that God cares so deeply about. Do you follow me? God cares about everyone. We talked about this a few weeks ago. He has every hair on your head numbered. He knows everything about you. And it's the same thing for everyone else. It's just incredible to think about how deeply he cares and how infinitely he knows at the same time. And with that in mind, we go to the last thing that his name means in this text. He says, I am enough. I am enough. When he says I am, he's saying I am eternal. He says I am engaged, but he also says I am enough. And we see this in his response to Moses' concern over his own inadequacy. We see it in verses 11 and 12. It says, but Moses said to God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? And God said, I will be with you. I will be with you. Moses says, who am I to go do this? I can't do this. I'm not qualified. This job's way above my pay grade. He says, I will be with you. And the idea here is that God's presence is what makes all the difference. We're talking about an all-knowing God and an all-caring God at the same time. His presence is what makes the difference. It wasn't Moses' resume that was making the difference. It wasn't his confidence and charisma or lack thereof. It wasn't those things. It was just, I will be with you, and that is enough. And God illustrates this truth as well earlier in the passage through sanctifying the ground where Moses stood. Remember in verse 5 that God said to him, do not come any closer. Take off your sandals, for the place where you're standing is holy ground. Why was Moses instructed to remove his sandals? He was driving home a point that God's presence alone changed the entire dynamic of the ground that he was standing on. And that itself was novel in a time where God's presence was associated with specific places. This ground where God was appearing to Moses was not sacred the day before. There was nothing about the dirt itself that was different. It was God's nearness to it that made it holy. That's what changed things for his forefathers as well, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Not their greatness. It was his presence, God's presence with them, that made all the difference. And that same dynamic, God's presence with Moses, is what would make things different when he appeared before Pharaoh. It wasn't that he had courage or charisma or that his past had been rehabilitated in some way. He was still a fallen and broken man just like before, but God was going with him. God is enough, and he's all you actually need. What does this mean? It means two things. First, if you stop and think about it, it means that our spiritual heroes weren't as great as we tend to think. We tend to put them up on pedestals for good reason. I understand it completely. Some of us more than others, but how many of you have ever thought, I could never be bold and courageous like the Apostle Paul? How many of you have ever thought, I could never be brave like King David? How many of you have looked at your own heroes throughout history, historical leaders, or whatever, and looked at them and said, I could never imitate those guys. I could never be like them, all right? The reality is that these are deeply flawed human beings whose only real reason for success was that God's presence was with them. If you were to take away that presence, Moses was still a fugitive shepherd with a violent past. Remember, Moses fled Egypt initially, having killed someone, murdered someone. You take away that presence, and David is still a shepherd boy, nobody, who was so insignificant that his family didn't even bother bringing him to the sacrifice to call him in from the field. And Paul was a man who spent years hunting down and imprisoning Christians. You take away God's presence and he was still that broken and fallen man. Their greatness was never the explanation. God's presence was the explanation for everything that they accomplished and everything they did in his name. So our heroes aren't as great as we might think, and we need to realize that if we feel like we don't measure up, or if we feel like we're not capable of much, remember that we can do all things through Christ who strengthens us. Remember that God's presence with us and what he's calling us to do is all that really makes a difference anyway. Secondly, it means something else. It means that we're not as great as we think we are when we have success once in a while. Keep that in mind. Because first you're going to have inadequacy and say, oh, I don't think I can do this. Then you're going to go in obedience and you're going to take action in God's name and you're going to have great success. And when that happens, something can trip in your brain that's very dangerous, and that is, oh, wow, that was really awesome. How did you do that? You didn't. You didn't. It was God's presence with you, all right? Every now and again we have wins. Probably all of you guys can think of times where you did something, you're like, where'd that come from? You know, every time that you do something really cool or something where people stand back and look at you and say, wow, that was really great. I'll throw my work example in now. I mean, all the time, I get called up to the front to deal with angry customers working at the grocery store at night. And they're like, Dan, there's somebody here who's really mad and we can't get him calmed down. And I'll walk up and I'll talk to him and I'll de-escalate him and I'll have him smile and I'll walk out the door. And people will be like, oh, how'd you do that? You know, it's very easy in those moments to say, yeah, it's because I'm so wonderful and so great. The reality is that God is with me and God is blessing me. And I would not be able to do any of those things if he withdrew his hand. And you must live with that constant awareness, all right? He is all you need. He is enough. But when you are succeeding, don't forget that he's the reason that for your success, he's the one that's causing it. And so what do we need to remember in conclusion? We need to remember that God's name, the name that is so sacred that its very pronunciation was eventually lost to history, was never given. It was never about saying it correctly. It was given so that we could know him. And the idea here is that God is eternal, he is aware, and nothing that happens today or tomorrow catches him off of guard. It also says that I am engaged, or he is engaged. He is active in this world when we can't perceive the moment, and he cares for you. And there isn't a person in this world who's suffering that's overlooked or forgotten. And it also means that I am enough. He is enough. Not because we're ever going to be qualified on our own, but because his presence is what turns ordinary holy ground and ordinary fallen people into amazing saints that can do extraordinary things in God's name. And so just remember that I am is enough for Moses, and he is enough for us today as well. With that being said, let's pray.